population will become less willing. Class develops. As the middle class becomes more aware of its own interests, it will become less willing to live in an undemocratic, I cited that wrong. 56, less willing to live in an undemocratic. Okay, so as the educated population, quote, becomes less willing to live in an undemocratic political structure, it will establish the rudiments of a civil society, organizing to protect its own interests, right? So, I'll read that again. The educated population will become, obviously, smarter, and insofar as they become more educated, they will become less willing, right? I'm going to be more aware of my impoverishment, my lack of freedom, my lack of rights in a Fourier'ian sense, and insofar as I recognize the institution of my subjugation, I am more likely to rebel and overthrow that institution. The recognition of that institution of subjugation is only facilitated by recognizing its existence. Hence, you need the education to see how you have been structurally abused, right? So, obviously, I end up establishing civil society, right? I end up educated population then will be less likely to accept an undemocratic political structure. Right? An educated population is going to be less likely to accept an undemocratic political structure. So, as we've seen, sort of expanding the syllogism here, increasing capital and an increase in the standard of living increases the level of education in the population. The educated population then will be less likely to accept undemocratic political structures precisely because they recognize the institution of their subordination. So that's 4. Number 5, if you're still following now, number 5, and that should be clear, a more humanistic ideology develops among the more liberalized political spheres. Right? If we have an undemocratic political ideology, totalitarian or an authoritarian political structure, then that's going to lead to a more silenced, pacified, quiet population. A democratic political structure is going to have a multiplicity and foster and encourage a multiplicity of ideological views. Insofar as I have a multiplicity of ideological views, quote, the more liberalized political sphere is going to be. The political sphere is going to have to represent that liberalized sort of multiplicity of ideological stances, right? So that the political system becomes more liberalized. And I don't necessarily mean right-left per se liberalized, though that is an implication, but it better reflects the transformation within the political structure. It is inherently gone from a very totalitarian, authoritarian political structure to at least a more liberalized, it doesn't have to be liberal in the sense, but a more liberalized, a less authoritarian, a less totalitarian political structure. Why? Precisely because the constituency has transformed, right? The educational transformation into constituency transformed the nature of the political structure, to be actually very technical. So, a more humanistic ideology develops among the more liberalized political sphere. I just explained that. As the market spreads and impersonal market relations become common, or market trust helps to build the social trust necessary for functioning political democracy, right? What ends up happening as a consequence of this is, quote, capitalism is a necessary then, though it's not a sufficient prerequisite for democracy, right? The spread of capital, increased capital, transforms the standard of living, but that capital would not have been invested were it not for the fact that obviously these transnational corporations are going to be reaping more money, right? So I reap a huge surplus of money, profit, and then I reinvest and I continue to reinvest as long as my profits are being driven, right? So, insofar as my profits are being driven, I continually reinvest a portion of those profits back into the infrastructural, educational, blah, blah, blah of the community, right? Either directly or indirectly. Either I directly do it as an act of charity, or I just continually employ generation after generation of workers, but that continued economic investment into sort of the generation of workers leads to a burgeoning middle class, and that middle class then becomes more educated. That educated middle class then transforms the nature of the political ideology, because the ideology has to satisfy the new recognition within the educated population that, hey, you're not going to oppress us. I know what you're doing now, right? I understand what structural violence is. I recognize exploitation of abuse, and I have rights. And this is precisely where, in an optimistic interpretation of the expansion of global capitalism in the 21st century, that you can see that this is actually a good thing. Right? It's not all bad. This is actually a good thing. There is an opportunity in which transnational corporations and their not perpetual, but their continual reinvestment into undemocratic societies with high instances of human rights violations will transform the nature of society and ultimately the political paradigm within that society as such, right? So again, very, very technical, but I also think extremely powerful, right? With the caveat that we're not saying, at least I'm not saying, and I agree with the author, capitalism is a necessary, meaning that it's one of the conditions for democracy, but it in and of itself isn't, the be-all, end-all. Capitalism is a necessary, though not sufficient prerequisite for democracy. So that's that point. Next point is, final point in section 4.1, is that without capitalism, democracy appears to become impossible, right? This goes back to the discussion of democratic peace theory, right? Without capitalism, without this sort of global transnational investment into the economic stabilization of markets globally, right? I'll say that again. Without the transnational contributions to the economic stabilization of markets globally, it doesn't seem like democracy is at all possible, right? It is likely, though it's not necessarily the case, but at least under this interpretation, it is likely that political institutions will remain totalitarian, will remain authoritarian, populations will be denied educational opportunities, which will prevent them from recognizing the totality of systemic abuses and exploitations in process. And it's a lose-lose. Rather than recognizing that the spread of capitalism actually helps to increase the global middle class, maybe not a specific middle class, but the global middle class rises. Therefore, the accessibility to educational opportunities and resources rises globally, maybe not specifically, and thus the engine driving that global educational difference, that global sort of human rights difference, is precisely capitalism. It's capitalism that's driving it. Very sort of difficult argument for most to swallow, because your sort of gut response is capitalism is the boogeyman, right? When in sense that is true, but that's one part of the equation, right? It's yin and yang, it's a balance, there's good with the bad. The good is capitalism is and the growth of global capitalism is the, arguably, source for both human rights violations in a pejorative sense, in a negative sense, in a bad sense, but really and truly it's making the world a better place, right? It's making the world a better place precisely by affording more educational opportunities through economic investment, and simultaneously transforming the nature of authoritarian regimes to become more democratic. That's a win-win for most, right? So pretty interesting argument. So without